Hello, welcome to Fear Talk number 11 with the guest today, Steve Nation, who is working out of the United Nations on some part-time of his work. We'll get to that in a moment. Steve and I came together in a very unique way, and we have a sort of secret that we will unveil today, Steve, something from your tradition of which is the theosophy background into the Alice Bailey Foundation work that you do as well. So we'll get to that in a moment. We just want to just tease people with a little bit that this talk is going to enter some domain that my usual fear work does not often publish on or even have discourses on, and that is what we might call the occult, the esoteric world. And so you are from that background. So before we get to that, let me introduce my philosophy and give a sense for you, Steve, as well. Of I set up Fear Talks, a couple years ago because I thought it feels like there's almost a fear to talk about fear that pervades in a kind of insidious way of silencing honest, authentic conversation. So I'm not talking about the ability to express fear. That seems to have a lot of freedom in certain ways, right? And to emote and to project and let it fly at times, even though that's not the case for everybody, for sure. There is a repressive quality to how people experience fear. But on a collective level, I felt like there was a discourse that wasn't being allowed. So I said, well, I'm just going to call it Fear Talks. Put it right up front. That's what the name of it is. So you know when you come on stage, when you come onto the video to watch, you kind of know where we're going. And it's not a self-help fear talk, right? It's not a motivational fear talk and a solution fear talk. Is really, I think, where you come from as well in your work with the United Nations, appreciating this long traditional and sacred tradition of dialogue. And the dialogic moment, which I sort of see and frame for this talk, and I'll end this intro in a moment, it is when we can enter a domain of conversation. We're going to pick a sort of topic, fear, fearlessness, that kind of thing. However, it is about really a co-inquiry where we are coming to this as inquirers, not necessarily to argue and find, this point better than that point, agreement, disagreement. That's not really my interest in this fear talk. So there's places for argument. There's places to publish those arguments. There's places to do those kinds of discourses. I'm not against them, but I think what's really short in the world, something that I don't see enough, is to co-inquire into the notion of fear and fearlessness. And really, we're going to talk about human history. We could even talk about cosmic history today, folks. We're going to go as big macro scale. We're going to come down to micro scale. And I know Steve is an inveterate lifelong learner. I've already picked that up from our very first engagements. And I don't know him hardly at all. He hardly knows me. So that also creates an excitement about how we ask each other questions. This is not an interview. It's not staged. It's not scripted. On all those notes, I want to just introduce something and then I'll have Steve do an invocation. So what I want to introduce is an ethic to this dialogue, to the Fear Talks. And this comes from a couple conceptions that I've used very briefly. This term here, Addenda, which in Sanskrit is the gift of fearlessness. Abhaya, no fear. Dana is the gift. And so the notion of gift culture is something that interests me a lot. And that's a challenge to the kind of culture that tends to dominate most of the world that Steve and I and many of my viewers hang in. And that also leads to a very practical, from a work of Robert Sardello, a book called Freeing the Soul from Fear. And on one of the pages when I read that book, he's a spiritual psychologist, well respected in certainly the Western part of the world. And one of the pages of the book, I was struck by a notion. He said, one of the difficulties we have to enter a talk, a discourse about fear, is the fear that that brings up itself for many of us. And he thought, we ought not, at least consciously attempt to, we ought not, and this is the ethical dimension, talk about fear in ways that bring up unnecessary fear. In other words, create more of the syndrome of that fear cycling, which often is unconscious, reflexive, toxic, and disabling to our human potential. So I'll turn it over to you, Steve, to give us an invocation today. You can explain a little bit why, and this is really a moment of just reflective time.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for inviting me. But it's good to get to know you a little bit on your work, your beautiful work on fearlessness. To me, it's like a symbol. There are so many initiatives happening today to deeply address the healing of the psyche, the healing of the human, and that reflects into every part of economics, politics, every profession, every part of social life. So bless you. There's just one, I'm going to start with the invocation. I'm going to behave myself and I'll do that. But there's one thing I wanted to, in your lovely introduction, to say that I don't come from the UN. I don't represent the UN. I actually work for, in technical terms, for an NGO. That has an activity that's associated with the UN, along with thousands of other NGOs. And it's important for me to clarify that because we work in an esoteric field, and there are some whose thinking is deeply challenged by that, and therefore they make all sorts of false accusations about a tiny little group of thinkers, as if they have some influence over the UN. And of course, we're simply part of all people of goodwill who are trying to serve as well as we can. So that's important. So I thank you for the thought of starting with invocation and thinking of you and I together, and also those who will be watching our chat. And so together, if we have in mind this thought, that the tradition that I come from is everything is essentialized into a single invocation, and it's called the Great Invocation. And to me, what's important about this is not so much the words themselves as an attempt to think of all human beings who at this time in the evolution of our species are consciously engaged in creating a better world and in their own development and their ability to love, their ability to work with dana, with gifting, generosity, joy, all of the traditional qualities. So if we just think of this vast today network of people of goodwill, and at their heart, people whose whole life's meaning and purpose is about the transformation, not just of the human spirit, but of the human behavior, of the actual human being itself. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into human minds. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into human hearts. May the coming one return to earth. From the center, where the will of God is known, let purpose guide all little human wills, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center, which we call the human race, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. So
Lovely. So who's that by?
it's in the Alice Bailey books. The tradition I come from comes out of theosophy, and there's a whole series of 24 books by a writer called Alice Bailey. And these books were supposedly communicated to her telepathically by a wise one. And there's no claim that these teachings are the only teachings, or it's just that they are, for me, they are my teaching. My life has been centered around this teaching for certainly all of my adult life, since I was 21. And it's a branch of theosophy that's it relates the sort of ageless wisdom, drawing on a Christian background and an Eastern background, to both the human being, the individual in today's world, and human society. So it looks at humanity as a whole and the problems faced by humanity. And really, it's a teaching for what's called discipleship, which really means for those individuals, and now there are huge numbers of individuals who really are called to serve, and really have that simple question as moving through our lives: how can we be of use? How can I be of use in this time of obvious need, obvious sort of psychological, physical need?
Including ecological
Absolutely.
connection. Yeah. How does theosophy, traditional, probably one could say it's probably a humanistic tradition. If I was to summarize with a spiritual, expansion to that, how has it changed in your time of watching to include sort of the ecological, the beings other than humans, and the natural world, even in that
Yeah.
sense? Can you give an
Yeah,
update?
yeah. I'd rather that, because I'm not so. I mean, it's pretty amazing that one tends to. I mean, for me anyway, I focused in on this is a big teaching, so I'm not so outside of this teaching. There are other areas of theosophy that I certainly wouldn't feel confident to speak on, but from within our little tradition, um, the fundamental part of the teaching is about the relationship between the kingdoms and about humanity, that the sort of humanity is going through a crisis of initiation as a species. And in technical terms, that means humanity as a whole stepping onto a spiritual path, um, choosing to embark on a path that it will allow our higher angels to become a more dominant part of our identity as a species and the way in which we express ourselves. That's a sort of way of looking at history, I guess. And within that, the teachings have always had this thing about that humanity's task is to become the stewards and also the educators of the other kingdoms. And so it's always been central there. But in our work, certainly reflecting what's happening in humanity, there's a much, much greater awareness of the relationship between the human, the animal, the plant, the mineral, and the earth as a being in and of itself. And I think, to me, the emergence of environmental consciousness is one of the clearest signs that humanity is on an initiatory path. Because where it's come from, it didn't exist in the sort of Second World War. Then sort of this modern spiritual crisis, to me, comes out of that period. So we had this great visionary thing that led to the founding of the UN, and spiritually almost the high point, the four freedoms, this incredible principle of Roosevelt that reverberated through not just a national statement, but reverberated through human consciousness, and then took expression in the Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah,
And you can
1948, I believe.
exactly, and you can say these things are just sort of like legal documents or something,
Yeah.
but they, in terms of not just symbology, but they establish a norm, and that is hugely influential in legal terms, because it sort of sets up a whole new series of fights, a whole new series of conflict, which is the way we progress. But also in terms of international relations, of diplomacy, and echoing through every field, so economics, every field of life, this Declaration of Human Rights, this idea that to see the person behind the face, to see the person within the face, regardless of however you're going to classify, if you're going to classify by race or by language or culture or economic class, you first of all see the person, and the uniqueness and the sort of the beauty that is the human being. And you see that that is one side of a coin, and the other side is this universal spirit, this fact that we are what, that as I live my life, and I mean, for me, as you and I and all of us who are sort of taking time listening to watching this, as we live our lives, the sense that it's as if humanity itself is living through in our life. We are the universal human, and therefore it's not because of that, but the fact that we have a sense of responsibility about the way in which we spend our time, the fact that we learn to love our humanity and to be gentle with our fears and our incompleteness, all of this is part of our time. And it's a way of looking. I mean, I've since since high school, I've had a mad love of the United Nations. God knows why, where it came from. No
Yeah.
idea. But I've always sort of loved it. And it's just, and to me, all these things are reflected in the UN. And if you look at the recent history of the UN since its founding, actually, you go see these periods of a high point, then we come into the Cold War. So then everything at the UN is sort of, although there might be some nice words, in fact, everything comes down to the power politics of the Cold War, us versus them. That's the reality of it. Then suddenly the Berlin Wall falls.
Yeah.
There's a moment of opportunity. It's like an earthquake. People write about an earthquake at the UN because all of a sudden, for the first time, there was a period when people actually talked about human development. So instead of using the language of human development and as a way of beating the enemy,
Putting it in economic terms almost always immediately, and power, privilege, pivotal points of who's going to lead, who's going to get that advantage, right?
exactly, a
Yeah.
hidden agenda. And so then all of a sudden you had, and that reflected in the UN when you had this series of massive, I think of them as like ritual meditations. So you had these big international conferences involving not just governments, but what can be called the third UN, which is becoming increasingly important, of sort of academic institutions, think tanks, and pressure groups, NGOs, a vast array of groups that have made their identity about particular issues. And so you had these big, the Women's Conference in Beijing was very well known, the first Environment Conference, conferences on society and development, conference on population, huge gatherings involving large numbers of people with governments present, where it actually was about ideas.
Whoa, ideas. I don't know, Marianne Williamson, who ran for president,
Yeah.
Democratic leadership, one of the things she said, I just wrote a book on her and her presidential candidacy. I did a study of that
Mm.
phenomenon, the Marianne Williamson phenomenon, because I thought it was so unique in the history of American politics,
Yeah.
certainly in the contemporary time. And one of her favorite phrases that I saw her use a few times was, politics should be first and foremost about ideas. And that was the pivotal change. And then she has this other big agenda, which I'm now going to focus on, FearTalk, around the UN for a moment. She had the other big agenda that she said, we need a politics of love, quote. And that is a politics that is the alternative to a politics of fear. This is directly her documentation. This is her policies are built upon this. And when this is a very high level of consciousness being brought into the political sphere. Let's go to the UN, because you're talking also about in post-World War II, this new consciousness, right? And then, you know, even through time, it's evolved and more groups are attempting to raise the awareness of a consciousness on the planet for alternative ways, as we probably come to a kind of an end collapsing time, arguably, of some of the worst aspects of a predatory capitalism and domination worldview. And so in the UN, I was fascinated in my fear research to zoom in on that declaration in 1948, but it had an earlier, I think back to 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt was involved, as well as FDR, in forming these four freedoms, as I understand, just generally. And
Yes.
one of the freedoms was freedom from fear and want. And of course, as a fearologist,
Those are two of the freedom from fear and freedom from want. Yeah.
they're two separate ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. And I was just zoomed in immediately. I said, here's a universal awareness and a declaration. And I'm just going to back that up. And I said, I think it's an echo. I think it's an echo of something that came out of FDR himself in his 1931 inaugural address to the American people in the midst of the Depression, which is going to be relevant to our little secret that we're going to talk about today about the League, is that he said to the people in this time of immense fear and terror, collapsing systems, all the problems of what was happening in America and around the world, but mostly certainly America. And he said, what we suffer from is the problem of fear itself. These are, again, these are like, for me as a historian, academic thinker, I go, wow, okay, there's another arising of this consciousness, then brought into the four freedoms some years later. Is it not interesting that it keeps going?
Exactly.
And so we'll get back to that, but I want to read for the moment from Alice Bailey off the internet in a discussion with Dwal Kul, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, good.
I believe is the another name for the Tibetan master source. And this is a discussion they're having about the initiate, right? The pursuer, the seeker of this higher human potential that's in all of us. Again, without particularly describing a religion, a doctrine to follow, or even to convert. No, it's to me more a philosophy. And here's a quote from what I found on the internet. Have you respond to it. Your sphere of work is clear to you. And there you are, both needed and useful, which is all that you desire. The keynote of your daily work should be understanding, just as the keynote of your work with yourself on all three planes should be fearlessness, with love coloring all your life. There are the three worlds which express what should be the color tone of your life expression from now until the call comes for you to serve on the other side of the veil of life. Ponder on these three words: understanding, courage or fearlessness, and love, for the remainder of your life of service. For, quote, as a man thinketh, so he is. The idea we have is the idea we will be. Any other comments you have on that quote?
Only that, that's beautiful. Only that I think that we're at a time now when that quote is something to do with Alice Bailey or the Tibetan. It's something, there is now a significant number of people from every culture, every part of the world, for whom that quote essentializes their identity. You know, I really believe that we have such a depressed view of where we are as a species. We have such a depressed view of politics. And so, say, Marianne Williamson talking about the politics of love, what I think is that if we're now at the stage where every one of us, instead of dreaming about the politics of love, has an infinite range of opportunities to contribute to something that is already in process of being born. The politics of love is a process in history that is now underway. And it's helpful when a leadership type person can enunciate that, because that can completely change the way in which we see our lives, that our lives have significance because we're contributing to this birthing of something that we always, mystics, just dreamed about as something lovely and sweet to talk about and write a poem about. But now it's gutsy, and it's got some grit in it. It's human, so it's full of success and failure. It's full of trial and error.
And expect when you draw down that kind of truth, and you draw it down into the mass medium consciousness and the institutional consciousness. Expect is what I sort of teach. Expect. That's like piercing a boil.
Yes, exactly.
On the back of your neck. That's going to come back at you. It's going to go like this. And so one of my favorite phrases is I think I would love to have an education where we learn right from kindergarten is what happens when fear meets fearlessness? What happens when fear meets love? What happens when love meets fearlessness? What happens when love meets fear? Just to begin imagining that our conflicts so much at a fundamental level of this really emotion, motivational emotion of how I believe we mostly operate by. Love and fear is sort of the classics I have found in all the sacred traditions, the wisdom traditions. They talk about this tension. Expect it. So expect what? Well, expect fear to respond to that kind of love. And so one of the things about the fear talks and my work on fearlessness, why did I focus on that and not love, is I get concerned when there's so much love talk. And that's why I liked there was 3 words. There wasn't just the love word. You might have noticed love was the third, actually.
Right, exactly.
And I went, yes, thank you. Because it's so easy to, in our despair, and rightfully so, understandably, in our woundedness, in our even post-traumatic condition, it is easy to want to get that love, to get that God of love, to get that right, perfect being, place, center in our hearts or wherever. And it's all wonderful to hear, and it's poetic and it's lovely. And then I say, and be prepared when that love comes down. Be prepared. I think any great wise teaching says, and be prepared. The prophets knew this. They spoke like that. They didn't just spoke in lovely, poetics for the most part.
And I would say it's exactly, but in addition to that, it's not just be prepared, that's the way we grow.
Thank you, yeah.
Through this resistance, that's actually a positive thing. So for me, one of the things about this present time, the sort of madness of all the stuff, the Brexit debate in Europe, the stuff that's happened in the US, certain things have happened. To me, they're wonderful because they're a sign that there should be that reaction because something pretty strong is happening. And so if there wasn't a reaction, you'd say, well, is it just sitting on a level of mind? Is it not coming down into substance. Because in my own life, I know that, you know,
Yeah, what gives you
matter is being redeemed, matter is being transformed. So,
what gives you faith? You know, what gives you faith, or how did you come about the faith to understand this very high level of, yeah, well, this is how we learn, you know, this is all very nice, right? But we know people are suffering, people are dying. There is a lot of horror and terror and going on in the world for people. And this is reverberating in me if I really sit with it. How do you come to, have you in your life come to, just briefly anyway, kind of seen this face of this larger perspective? This is how we learn, so that conflict is not just a negative thing, right, that we try to avoid, and then we come up with all these wonderful virtues, but we don't
yeah,
really realize the battle that is actually going to be required.
exactly. Well, I've worked with the teaching. So for one thing, there's a teaching that obviously helps because it provides a detached way of looking at it. With a teaching, one of the fundamental ideas, I think it's probably central to all real teachings, is to say, well, some of this, it's hard for me to tell if it's right or wrong. How the hell would I know? But there's a lot in this that really strikes me as true. So let me work with an attitude that says, okay, I've built a certain trust, so let me work as if this were real. It may not be, but then I'll find out. Otherwise, I'm just like a dilettante looking at this, looking at that. So that's one thing. But there's something more than that, because with any real teaching, which I think is important for someone to move from fear to, well, certainly to move to real faith, because real faith is a sense that this other possibility is something that's real. In other words, it's something. Belief is one thing, but faith is something like this, an essential reality that you begin to sense, and you certainly may not be able to frame it in your mind, but it's something that you know is true. It's to do with goodness, the goodness of the person who happens to be in front of you for a second, and there's some sort of sense of goodness and beauty.
Yeah.
There's potential everywhere, but it's something that's real. So that gives you, once you recognize that's what I think is the essence of faith. But also, for me, I would say three things. This is the sort of core of the training that in our work we have a school. It's a correspondence school, and it's a school that's based on three principles: study. So in other words, training the mind in cosmology and metaphysics. So it gives the mind some structure within which, like an environment, an ecology of mind. Study, meditation, which is really the way of which one enters into the livingness of that structure, and
Discipline.
discipline, yeah, and a practice that where you are training the mind, like education for the mind. And then thirdly, service. So, and without anyone ever telling you because the service is a lifelong quest to be of use, and everyone has to find their own path of service, has to find what service means, has to be more humble, and because so often we think service means being the president or the prime minister or something, and service is
And
simply the way we live our life.
how is it different than do-gooder? You know, I sometimes get a little cautious with do-gooding
Right,
and what virtue signaling that is very
right,
common today. People
right,
want to look good and do the right thing.
right.
So
Well,
what's
I
the
think
discernment?
service is the reality. So
The
it's
reality
like
of
it's easy for us to judge others, and this thing of it being a do-gooder
it. Yeah.
is something it's almost in the psyche that if it's something we don't like, or even if it's something we like because it makes us feel inadequate, we brand a do-gooder. And maybe, or maybe not, I don't
Right.
know. But the only thing I do know is for myself. The only thing so the challenge is, what do I do if I think that I'm currently just like a do-gooder, just doing things because I get appreciation for it and it just makes me feel good? Then that's not what I want. So what could I do today? What discipline could I start to do that would help me move closer towards true service? And to me, like teaching a structure for the mind is really pretty important, but there's not one structure. There are different structures, and sometimes they're contradictory. And
Yeah, I
that doesn't,
agree. We operate on many levels of consciousness in a kind of,
so,
pyramid, or not pyramid, but, a kind of, well, even a pyramid, as Maslow says, we have multiple motivations,
yes,
and it's not always we're in one place, right? It could be
exactly.
lower motivations at one time, higher motivations at another, but we're a complex of those.
Exactly. I mean, the theosophical tradition, and this comes from the Eastern tradition, and all real esoteric traditions, and also in Western religion, in Greek, the Greek tradition, there are levels of emotion, levels of mind, and levels of will. And once that sort of model has some realism to it and your identity, the challenge becomes to build the bridges um, in these levels and to,
Bridges being integration points or
yeah, yeah, they'll result in integration points, and they'll ultimately result in fusion
yeah.
between this level and that level. It's a hierarchical view. Spiral dynamics is one expression of it. Integral is another. But it's that there are these levels, and really all esoteric traditions, so the deeper traditions in every faith, always have had this view of a chain of being. Um, and so it's a different way of looking at psychology, because you look at mind and you see these levels of mind in simplistic terms, sort of concrete mind, almost the mind that's most associated with the brain, and then the 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 soul, or the son of mind, which is can think of as the loving mind, in Buddhist terms, the loving mind, and then beyond this, the abstract mind, where of pure ideas um, that are beyond any form, that then our work as human beings is to bring these pure ideas into a creative thought form. In other words, into the rational thinking. And in the professions, in any profession, I'd love to talk about education, because
Oh,
this
yeah.
is your field, and I think everything is about education. I mean,
I do too.
it's a one. And I was just preparing for this talk, I was looking at, this is where I think that we're so depressed in the way we see things. And sure, we see that most education is not maybe what we would like it to be, but on the other hand, look at this now, a whole field of contemplative education
Right.
at the academic level,
Yeah.
at a senior level.
Yeah.
Now, 20 years ago, there was no such thing.
Not in the academy for sure.
No, exactly. And the academies, um, they have, because they really do represent where there's huge investment in minds. So even if we might say that the academies reflect a sort of older consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
in dominant, that's true, but then so does everything. Um,
It's like religions, right? They'll also represent the mode of the main, but then there's always this occult.
there's the new this new thing that's being born, and this has become.
You just froze there for a moment. I hope you come back here.
activities, and one of them is World Goodwill. And we do a newsletter. And in a recent newsletter, it's looking at the sort of big problems facing humanity. And in the article on education, it looked at spirituality in education, and in the context of that, looked at in the Americas, because I don't think it's just US, in certainly North America, the something called the Collaborative for Spirituality in Education. I don't know if you know it. It's at Columbia University, and
No.
this is like a huge sort of think tank that's publishing material. It's doing solid research. And it's covering a wide range of, including mindfulness, but not only mindfulness. So a wide range of initiatives from all different levels of education who are sort of developing a universal approach to spirituality. So it's not a religious based, although it will include religion.
Yeah.
But it's just a way of looking at values and ethics that accept almost these different levels of mind and heart. And that to me gives us such hope, because we can see that there's this form and scaffolding starting to take place around which we will, as a species, look head on at this problem of fear.
Great. The fear problem, capital
The
F,
fear problem,
capital
yeah.
P.
Yeah, and it is the fear problem. And in a way, one of the things about this crisis, the sort of political crisis, it's focused in the US at the moment, and that's significant only because the US is a particularly strong power in the world. It's hugely powerful. But sort of at a deeper level, like I find so many people, I always try to direct the conversation this way, but it turns out that what's happening is that they are reevaluating their life because of this, because they're so depressed and disturbed, I suppose is more like it, about the absence of good, the apparent complete rejection of goodness as a principle. People are finding that that's forcing them to become themselves, look at goodness in themselves and the way they live their life. And to me, what's more important is the way they practice their profession. Because, you know, our professions are where we really contribute to evolution. And it doesn't matter what that profession is, but we spend so much time in our work. I mean, I love work. You know, it's so much of our time is there. And that's time that we sort of are often more concentrated than we are normally when we're just in the pub having a beer.
Yeah.
So our professions are really important. And now every profession is completely transformed by this revelation of interdependence. I mean, there's almost no level, there's almost no profession that hasn't been profoundly touched by the challenge of moving from just focusing on the tiny little part, you know, so becoming more and more specialized, and now seeing it's the relationship between the parts that actually are providing the next steps forward. And that's certainly, it's in medicine and health, but it's everywhere.
So the word collaboration, as you mentioned earlier, it's probably one of the pivotal terms for organizing an organizational structure, or, you know, it's kind of like a magnet in physics, right? Or an attractor in
Exactly.
complex systems, collaboration. But what we have to parse in that, for me, is we have to parse the motivation to collaborate, because there's lots of collaborations have gone on through history that one could question the motivational base. And that's why I'm trying to find another attractor to go with that. That's a good one. Of course, heart mind is another good one that's coming out of those spiritual, contemplative, educational objectives and researches. Good attractors, and I think the attractor that really has to be in there, and I think it was in those three, is, you know, fearlessness,
Yes.
courage. And it was interesting, they actually said, whether it's a typo or a translation miss, the actual term was courage or fearlessness. Now, before we get into talking about why you and I came together in the last 15 minutes here today, what brought us together, this little secret we're so-called, courage or fearlessness, that actually might be a really important distinction. The crux of my 30 years work says they are distinct. Now, whether, putting words on things, of course, is always problematic, and what do you mean, and when does one merge into another? So I'm not trying to be a super anal distinguisher of categories, but I do think there's discernments. And so I have a thesis. I won't go into it today, but just to say, I think there's a difference between bravery, courageousness, fearlessness, and fearless. And you can hear me on an integral spiral dynamic kind of thinking of arranging these fear management systems in a way. And what is a good language we could use, or perhaps a renewed language to make discernments, right? Between
Yes, exactly.
reactive bravery,
Exactly.
the moral courage and the interiority of reflection, the fearlessness of when we actually jump to the second tier idea, when we're conscious, we're no longer being motivated by primary fear-based motivations, and right to fearless, which you can call in the higher traditions the non-dual. And that is the languaging. I'm saying I think we could parse that language, and maybe it'll be useful guidance. So that's part of my teaching.
Oh, that's beautiful. I mean, one thought about that would be that courage relates to will.
That's
It's on
interesting.
the line of will, and
Okay.
will. This is not looking at will from this thing of determination and will coming from below up. It's will actually almost as a stable center, and will coming down. So it's
I think indigenous cultures would say it's what's the will of the community,
yeah, exactly,
the will of the commons,
exactly,
in
exactly,
ecological terms, or
exactly.
in religious spiritual terms, what's the will of God.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fine. Well, let's get to, in the last 15 minutes, delightful chatting with you. You wrote something at the bottom of one of your letters about 3 weeks ago, and you said to me, "It's great to be in touch, to know of your interest in the history of the Baileys and the work today to face and transmute fear." So thank you for saying that. I can just say it is incredibly rare in 30 years of my working and trying to put my work out into the world to hear anyone sort of get that respect for what you just said there. And then the history of the Baileys. Well, how did R. Michael Fisher come to the history of the Baileys? Well, it kind of came through. I was doing research on fearlessness, as I often do on the internet, and I came to the Academy of the New York Medical Library, and it said it had a document called Brochure, the League for Fearlessness. Not the League of Fearlessness. They actually have the League for Fearlessness on this brochure, which I will show you in a minute. And you will notice that the word for is in italics. That, to me, was a no unconscious move. This is a very conscious thing. So I'll just say, and you probably saw at the bottom, it said, organized an international movement to free the world from fear. Organized in New York, October 17th, 1931. This is not too much different than the exact date, and it's when FDR Roosevelt was saying we have a fear of fear itself. That, to me, was an articulation of the spirit of fearlessness that exists in the universe. The League for Fearlessness was emerging at the same time as this organization of 50-some people, it says in one point in the brochure. I'll just read it. Thank you for indulging. It says organizational meeting on the bottom of page 1 on the brochure. It's just a 4-page little brochure. The League for Fearlessness was organized by a group of 50 people in New York City who met at 11 West 42nd Street. You probably know where that is.
Yeah.
On Saturday, October 17th, 1931, to consider ways and means of meeting the present world conditions. The League was formed for the following reasons. just the first one, because a study of history demonstrates that such crises as that now exist are not essentially destructive, but are milestones in the path of progress, in the constant fluctuating ebb and flow of life. And then they go on in the brochure about their objectives. And basically on the first page it says, and this is what I want to turn to today, because this is how I reached out to you, because I looked up that Foster Bailey was the secretary of this organization. He is the husband of Alice Bailey, the well-known, theosophist. And the one point at the front here says, the initial program of the League to reach the public with appropriate literature dealing with the present world problem and the presenting the need for mobilizing the power of right thought to free the world from fear. United Nations, not too much longer, another decade and a bit, all of a sudden the four freedoms are coming out of FDR, his mouth, and then Eleanor Roosevelt getting involved for the United Nations Declaration 48. And you start to go, okay, so were the theosophists talking to FDR? Was FDR talking to them, or they were on some kind of, in their own languages? But then they say, and this is where I'll end the quote and then we'll chat, to send out literature as part of their program in English, French, German, and other languages. There's the United Nations, spirit, proclaiming the doctrine of fearlessness and confidence, and to inspire writers and speakers everywhere. Here's the educational mission. This is like a huge educational mission. Confidence, and to inspire writers and speakers everywhere to rally to the cause of pushing open the door of a new era of peace and prosperity by action based on clear thinking and courageous living. So courageous living was put in there as kind of, as you say, almost that will of the embodiment of the idea, right? The higher spiritual principle, and which they're calling here. We may not like the word doctrine today for various reasons. I understand that, but let's just call it the idea of fear, or the principle, and I prefer to even call it the spirit of fearlessness, which I actually think is an analogy to the Holy Spirit of the Trinity. Yeah. It's that which is not the Father, it is not the Son, it includes them, but it is glued together in a way, in a matrix, by the Spirit of fearlessness. And I think for every age, historically, contextually, culturally, one can find their own way to put the language and meaning on what that third part of the Trinity is, of this kind of ancient archetypal wholeness or unity. So I've just given you a sense of why I contacted you, because I knew Baileys were in the theosophical world. So I reached out to Lucis Trust, which you have been a member and a participant of for a long time in New York. And then we started a conversation, and you told me when I found this brochure.
What did I tell you? Yeah, it's interesting because to be honest, in the trust, we knew nothing about this doctrine, which was really interesting. And we're still looking into it, and there must be more about it, but there's remarkably little about that. And my sense is that this activity, World Goodwill, which Foster was very involved, very active with, which grew out of Alice Bailey's.
Oh, so World Goodwill grew up.
World Goodwill is a program, is an educational program.
How far back was that coined?
No, I think World Goodwill was officially started in the 50s.
Okay.
And became, this was after Alice died in 1949.
Right.
And so in, I think 1950, 51, I might be wrong, but I think that's when World Goodwill, under the name World Goodwill, it may have started earlier, and I suspect because this Fearlessness League it's the same. World Goodwill is the same thing. It's about education of the mind, and it's thinking about this. I was interested because the focus on goodwill, it goes back to what you were saying about love. Goodwill is sort of like a very practical, it moves away from all of the dreamy thing about love, and in terms of something more practical, less, more human, because it's more a little bit grey. Goodwill, and really it refers to motive. Goodwill really refers to, okay, say in politics, if I were a politician running for office, a goodwill approach would say, so my task is, beside any organizational or political things I have, is to identify people of goodwill, whatever their opinions are, and to try to bring together around certain things that could be done. And so therefore it's what you've said is dialogue, and that I think is where we're headed, to bring together. So this thing of the left and the right, like this terrible US thing of the red and the blue, really it's just a question of behind that finding the people of goodwill who are in either side. Then you've got something to work with, because you can't work with the people who just are so absorbed in hate that it's become not even hate necessarily, that's an unfair description, but are so absorbed in conflict and difference and separation that quite possibly in this life they're not going to break out of it.
So I
Fine.
think, thank you. Yeah. So
And
Goodwill is great, looking for people of goodwill. And Marianne Williamson, one of her platforms was, she said, because she's trying to be a bridge builder
right.
of this, kind of archaic system of binaries that are just so vicious after a while of difference, that she said, there are high Republican values and there are high
Absolutely.
liberal values,
Absolutely.
and there are on both sides, lower and
Exactly.
less ethical and reasonable values and operations. So she said, let's look for those highest common denominators, which I think any conflict transformation model that exists, that I know of in my research on conflict, is that's what you look for. You look for the highest principles and you look for the people of the highest goodwill at the same
Right.
time. So I'm just sort of, adding on to what you were saying.
Exactly. And to me, that is this fearlessness. Just thinking about it
Fearlessness
in
thinking. Okay.
listening to, um, I I think of fearlessness
Yeah.
in relation to, there's an idea of harmlessness,
Hmm.
which is something similar. And I think of that because it's usually thought of, it can be thought of as sentimentally in the same way that we think about
Harmlessness.
love.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also fearlessness. But I think of fearlessness actually as not courage, but definitely on the will line. In other words, spirit. It's,
Yeah.
I stand.
And that I is a capital I that goes beyond ego.
No, exactly. Exactly. And I stand on this, and also the little I can stand on this center of that that I know is within me. And so from time to time, crises will happen. And, it's how they say if something terrible happens to someone and you risk your life to save them, and you don't do it because you do it automatically. And the sort of standing I'm talking about is like that. It's something, that point of goodness within the self, um, consciously has become, has pulled you up to find human ways of it being able to be expressed through little old you. Um, and fearlessness is a bit like that, because it's like this thing of Aikido. Um, and I love the thing of, is this, something comes before you, and is this a worthy enemy, or is this not something worth me spending any time? And if it's a worthy enemy, I engage, because I know that this is life itself, and but I'll engage, and in full respect of the so-called enemy. Um, Otherwise, and much of the stuff nowadays is not, it's just stuff. It's not worth.
I call it a lot of dramatization.
Exactly. And it's better, as you said very early on, one of the earliest things, it's better not to fuel it, because it gets plenty of fuel. So
Yeah.
what I see, our task, I think, is to try to, in any relationship with the other, to try to find, to listen, to try to find something around which one can, with which one can work. And so, and often, so often, you know, I've been in battles, debating
Yeah,
arguments that are just pointless, senseless, and I wish the hell I'd never got into them, but
yeah, yeah.
simply because I wasn't sufficiently present to not follow that and
Mhm.
try and see if I could find something where we could talk together, because otherwise it's just a waste of time and you're actually reinforcing, you're doing more harm than good.
So nonviolent communications has, you've probably
Exactly.
heard of,
Exactly.
as part of a, new movement
Yeah.
and educational movement and practice.
Yes.
It looks at, well, you can try to find people that you can engage with, but you better be prepared. This is my interpretation, to be there for their needs first.
Right.
In some way, not
Right.
saying you're the rescuer of their
Good.
needs. I'm not saying a codependent, victim rescuer relation, but you better be aware that that's why the four freedoms are there, because they're based on needs
Yes.
for the most part,
Yes.
which are foundational. If people do not feel
Yes.
their needs are being heard or met, which is even better ideal, but at least heard and received, then you're probably not even going to get that principle of common ground that you might find will probably
Right.
break down pretty quickly to
Exactly.
keep you in a good relation if they don't
Exactly.
feel their needs are also being heard. And
Exactly.
you may or may not share your needs. That depends on, every situation, as you know, is an art of,
Exactly.
that
Exactly.
process of connecting. So
Exactly. And
um,
sometimes too, because you are hearing needs that are unspoken, that are not
yeah,
the needs that the person's conscious of, but you're
dramatizing.
trying to sense what the deeper needs are, and then you can contribute to
Yeah.
bringing those, in a non-threatening way.
So try this. So every fear that we watch being dramatized,
Yeah.
defensiveness, right?
Yeah.
Offensiveness as another
Mm.
fear reaction response, right? Flight, fight kinds of conditionings. Um, every fear that we experience, this is the sacred warrior in me that thinks of the battle I'm going into with fear, and let's just keep it in a kind of metaphorical way, is really a battle to realize is that everything that fear is doing, right, gets the big drama, it gets the big reaction, police come in, guards, security,
Right.
it's all this drama going on. But what's actually going on is fear is showing its desperation in its dramatization, and it's waiting for a response from the world. And underneath in the unconscious of that fear is the spirit of fearlessness itself.
Exactly.
And,
It's
and whether we see the fear or whether we can also see the spirit of fearlessness emerging. So I have this little dictum: when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. The reality or the problem will be whether we see the fearlessness arising or not, whether we pay attention. We
exactly.
will definitely pay attention to the fear and all its symptoms, all its
Exactly.
responses, heart rates, and all the
Exactly.
fear stuff. And so this is why this little dictum, I think, could be an interesting: when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. Are we willing to look for that spirit? Do we even now know how to look for it? And I'm saying our educational system's been so fear-based, it's so reproduced this culture of fear for so long, including myself. It takes a lot of decolonizing our minds from that matrix, the fear matrix. And I think this is what the League for Fearlessness was saying. We have to have a better education on what fear is and its ecologies in these deep, more networked, global understandings of fear, not just as a feeling and emotion, defending, that's a biological evolutionary, okay, that's one level. But what about how fear gets constructed into much more morphic patterns? And I come out with this kind of epistemological positioning, which basically is a doubtfulness that we even know what fear is fully.
I think definitely, and but also to me, more importantly, almost, is the reality of fearlessness, so that you can't address fear unless you address the fact that there's something else within us that is this fearlessness.
Yeah.
Um, because and then because once there's that recognition for education, then everything becomes about the path from fear to fearlessness. And that's then the only thing that matters.
So
Is
fear to fearlessness to love.
yeah, yes, yeah, and real the real love. You know, Christ, so long ago, it was the messenger of love, and in a way the Buddha also, but the Christ more significantly. They're two brothers in the system of thought. They're two great brothers, and the Christ in our system of the Buddha in our system of thought brought wisdom, and this thing of the mind and the role of the mind, the role of the observer, and what's now becoming mindfulness. The Christ brought the authority of the law of love, that love is the heart of everything. The whole of civilization and history has been working around these two systems. And we're now at a time where the sort of initiation is about bringing some of these, what have been ideas and ideals, looking in practical expression. And so this takes me back to the UN, and for me, the Sustainable Development Goals are the Declaration of Human Rights brought down into a brain level, if you know what I mean, because they're brought down to, so you have 17 goals, some of which are more, I suppose you could say psychological or spiritual than others.
Mm-hmm.
However, they're very practical. So the absence of hunger, education, ensuring that every child has education, bring them down to measurable targets that then can become transparent, because everybody can look at it and then put pressure on governments or on corporations, wherever one wants to put the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But it just reorients will, because it once you set a goal, it's like the Declaration of Human Rights, it set a norm. It's taken decades for that norm to become a little bit closer. It's taken centuries for these great visions of the Buddha and the Christ to seep into the psyche, where they're affecting our creativity in the way they are now, I think.
Okay. So one thing that's very interesting, and again, this focus on fear, the focus on, in a fear talk, you'll notice that I've always kept this dialectic framing, right? That we're going to talk about fear, and then I put up Abhaya, Dana, and I said, that's the ethic. You see, it's always a flow. We're going to focus on fear, and then we're always going to come back to focus on fearlessness. And that movement, to me, that's the love movement. That's the integral movement of consciousness in a nutshell, using these particular terms, fear and fearlessness, because that's my lens. I know it's not the only lens, but
no, but it doesn't matter. It's a real. It has reality to it.
Great.
It's beautiful. Bless you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I hope we can develop, an ongoing relationship as we see fit.
I look forward to that.
And we'll keep exploring this League for Fearlessness as what I call a pivotal moment in the history of fearlessness. I think this fearlessness, I have a map in front of me. I won't have time today to go into, and I've been tracking how could I map out some of the trees, right? The growth of the spirit of fearlessness. Maybe it stopped, went in another form, kind of an evolution of the spirit of fearlessness throughout history. So we could actually have a history. Like, wouldn't it be great to have a book that's the history of fearlessness? And then what I've noticed is lots of people in the last decade, probably 15 years, but mainly in the last decade, are writing about the history of fear. And there's many historians of emotion that is now a whole new subfield. These are marvelous movements to give us a history, not just the psychology of, but a historical understanding, at least a tracking, it's a marking, they're surfaces. And so why all the books on the history of fear? And there's no book on the history of fearlessness at this point in humanity. And I go, there's a reason, because we're more comfortable focusing on the fear as a symptoms, right? Rather than what it's arising in the moment. And historians are not going to be particularly all that useful. There are some books on the history of courage, bravery, but they often get very twisted into war and heroic, masculine, hyper-masculine kinds of narratives of bravado and aren't we resilient as a species kinds of narratives. And so we're really missing, because there's no theory. There's no theoretical framework that they have for guidance yet. And it's not their fault. It's just not clarified, I think, in enough ways. And then if I could, or not with others, mark out this history of fearlessness. So what I'm pointing to you today, the Lucis Trust, your work, the Bailey's work, the Theosophical movement, it's however it wants to participate, has its fingers in the history of fearlessness. And I want that not to be, if possible, demeaned or, and I don't sense it's being demeaned, but not forgotten. And forget is, of course, one of the denial mechanisms of the fear matrix that teaches us to forget that which will liberate us. And so the document per se in our pursuit, this conversation, thank you very much, is to me a really important point in my historical journey. So I'm being personal a bit now. It is just, you won't believe how my heart just goes into high gear on, wow, I get to talk about the history of fearlessness with someone who's connected, right, historically and in a practical way. Because you're not just a theorist, you're not an academic per se, and you're in this work, in part of the United Nations, efforts, which I would say are sitting on the spirit of fearlessness and manifesting in different forms. But this history of fearlessness is there. So I have a little fantasy I'm going to seed to the audience and to you as we close. I'll give you the last word. My fantasy is that we create a book, perhaps it's with me, with you, or Lucis Trust, or some publisher that's of understandable goodwill and understanding of what the work is, that we reproduce a book that has the League for Fearlessness document in it, reproduced and republished. And then we would have accoutrement writings, thinking, research. It doesn't have to be a thick book that would support and elaborate the spirit of that history of that League for Fearlessness. Because in 1989, as you know, I founded the In Search of Fearlessness project. I don't know if you knew that, but and that was an experiential long story. That's not what I want to publish about with this particular thing, but it's part, I ask myself, why did I do that? Why did I change my life completely in that understanding and co-founding of that project, In Search of Fearlessness project? And then when I found when I found this other organization that did that in 1931, you have no idea how that you have a sense of historical continuity, and you go, I think I'm on the same spiritual line. So that's what I'll close and let you respond to anything I said shortly, and we have to wrap up, but how this conversation was for you today.
Thank you. Conversation is beautiful. It's rich and authentic. And I'm intrigued in you and your colleagues holding a light, shining a light on the energy of fearlessness as a real cosmic energy. I think of it in relation to the energy of will, but that's neither here nor there. I can see the terrific value of a publication on fearlessness, drawing on all sorts of different traditions, including, say, some of FDR's speeches, you will know the real shining lights who've brought this idea of fearlessness. I imagine in some, there'll be some spiritual teachers for whom it's real, and would be deeply honored to include the League of Fearlessness, and would feel very, because to me it is one work. It's this thing of bringing these higher archetypes, and fearlessness is without a doubt one of the higher archetypes for all traditions and all professions. You know, do you know Parker Palmer? Parker Palmer's he's an elderly man now, educator and a Quaker
Oh, Parker Palmer.
psychologist. Yeah,
Parker Palmer. Your
Parker Palmer.
your
Yeah,
accent.
it messes everyone up. I don't even know myself what I'm saying half the time. But I think of Parker Palmer as someone also who's like an element of fearlessness in the way in which he has addressed his issue with depression. And it's that spirit which is different from courage. And I would say it's a part of the divine in us. So for you to bring together different elements that you yourself intuitively sense, even if they don't use the word fearlessness.
Yeah,
I mean,
he doesn't. He doesn't actually.
That's what, but that's okay because you are. To me, life itself draws these ideas out, and they don't have to all use the same words, because what matters is the thing itself, this energy itself, and what it has to contribute to our time, what it has to contribute to, say, the United Nations. And I was thinking of, if you have a look at something called Goodwill at the UN blog on the Goodwill website, there's a recent article of someone who's written a paper on the International Civil Service, and it actually is about the sort of moral crisis facing the international civil servants. In other words, those people who pledge their allegiance to the UN to be facilitators for the harmonizing of the actions of nations for the common good. Because she writes about fearlessness. I mean, I don't know that she used that word, but she says that the International Civil Service has to stand up in its relations to member states, and a redefinition has to occur. And of course, it's not so straightforward, but that's what fearlessness is. It's not straightforward.
Well, good for you. It's not.
All right, there you go.
I'm going to end on that beautiful line. Fearlessness is not straightforward. Tune in. Perhaps we'll do another talk, Steve, sometime.
All right.
All the best.
Good. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.